In the final decades of the 19th century, New York City pulsed with a restless kind of ambition. The streets below were crowded with carriages, factory whistles, and the constant rumble of construction, but above it all, in the ballrooms of Fifth Avenue, another world existed entirely. A world where a single raised eyebrow could end a family's social aspirations, and a single invitation could elevate them for generations. This was the age when wealth alone was not enough. One needed lineage, approval, and the right kind of presence to be counted among America's social royalty. At the center of this carefully drawn world stood Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, known simply as Mrs. Astor. She presided over New York society with the certainty of a monarch, and her word carried the same weight. The Astors represented what was called old money, though in truth even their fortune was barely a few generations old. But what set them apart wasn't the age of their wealth, it was the narrative they built around it. They had mastered the art of appearing timeless, aristocratic, unshakable. Under Mrs. Astor's direction, New York society became a fortress with guarded gates. The path inside was narrow, the rules unwritten but fiercely enforced, and the consequences of missteps harsh. The families she allowed into her circle were known collectively as the 400, the supposedly precise number of people who could fit into her ballroom. Whether the count was true or not didn't matter. What mattered was the message. Society was a closed club, and Mrs. Astor held the only key. The 400 moved according to strict codes. You attended the right opera, wore the right fabrics, greeted the right people, and married within the right circle. Even the slightest hint of impropriety, a vulgar show of wealth, a controversial relative, a fortune gained too quickly, could forever bar a family from inclusion. It didn't matter that America had no titled aristocracy. The old guard behaved as though they were building one from scratch. But outside the Astor drawing rooms, a new force was rising, faster, louder, richer. America's industrial boom created a class of millionaires whose fortunes dwarfed anything the old families had ever imagined. Railroad tycoons, steel magnates, bankers, oil barons, men who had earned their wealth not through inheritance, but through raw, relentless expansion. Their money didn't trickle in over generations. It arrived in sudden, staggering waves. This new money, as society dismissively called them, challenged the old order simply by existing. They built mansions larger than those of the old guard, bought art that once belonged to European aristocrats, and spent on a scale that made the Astors look restrained. But for all their financial power, they lacked something money couldn't purchase outright: legitimacy. To be accepted by the Astor set, it wasn't enough to be wealthy. One needed refinement, manners, lineage, or at least the appearance of such. And so, an intense rivalry emerged between those who inherited their place and those determined to buy it. New York's social world became a battleground, but one with no open conflict, a war fought through invitations, snubs, whispered judgments, and architectural statements. The opera box you owned, the horses that pulled your carriage, the number of liveried footmen waiting at your door, every detail became a line in a silent, high-stakes negotiation. But as the city filled with noise, construction, and grand ambitions, many families sought something quieter, more exclusive, a place where the rules could be observed away from the heat and chaos of Manhattan. That place was Newport, Rhode Island. What began as a summer refuge for a few wealthy families quickly transformed into the most competitive social stage in America. In Newport, wealth was displayed not in subtle gestures, but in monumental architecture. The cottages, as they modestly called their seaside mansions, grew larger, brighter, and more extravagant every season. Families measured their status by square footage, imported marble, and the number of guests they could entertain without strain. For the old guard, Newport was a serene retreat, a place to preserve traditions. For the new money families, it became something entirely different, an opportunity. A chance to prove that their wealth was equal to, or greater than, that of those who tried to keep them out. And nowhere was this competition more fierce than among the families, whose fortunes had risen faster than anyone believed possible. Among them was a name that would soon become synonymous with both ambition and grandeur: the Vanderbilts. New York may have been the battlefield, but Newport was where victory would be declared. And the mansion that would one day dominate its cliffs, the Breakers, began not as a symbol of triumph, but as an answer to a centuries-old question: who truly belongs among America's elite? Long before the Vanderbilt name became synonymous with palaces and prestige, it belonged to a single man with a ferocious determination: Cornelius Commodore Vanderbilt. He didn't inherit wealth, and he didn't charm his way into society with lineage or refinement. Instead, he built one of the greatest American fortunes with the blunt force of ambition, instinct, and an unshakable belief that he could outmaneuver anyone who stood in his way. Born on Staten Island with barely a formal education, the Commodore began with a small ferry service and turned it into a transportation empire. First with steamboats, then with railroads, he reshaped how America moved and how America worked. By the time he died in 1877, he had accumulated what would amount to over $200 billion in today's money. But in the drawing rooms of Fifth Avenue, none of that mattered. To New York's old guard, the Vanderbilts were not the right kind of rich. Their fortune was new, loud, and industrial, built from mud, steel, and steam rather than inherited land or family prestige. And despite the Commodore's unimaginable wealth, society doors remained closed. The Astors, Livingstons, Stuyvesants, the families who traced their lineage to the earliest Dutch settlers, dismissed him as a brusque businessman. Respectable perhaps, powerful certainly, but not one of them. After the Commodore's death, his heirs inherited not only his wealth but also his outsider status, and among them was a woman who refused to accept exclusion as fate, Alva Erskine Vanderbilt. Alva married William K. Vanderbilt, the Commodore's grandson. She was sharp, ambitious, socially fearless, and she understood something the Vanderbilts had not yet grasped. Old money guarded its doors, but it worshipped spectacle. If she could outshine them, she could outrank them. She began with architecture. Rather than blending in quietly, Alva commissioned the most extravagant mansion New York had ever seen, a French Gothic chateau on Fifth Avenue designed to make the Astor residence look modest. Marble imported from Europe, ceilings high enough for echoes, a ballroom larger than many public venues, the house was not subtle. It was a declaration. But Alva knew a mansion alone wouldn't win the war. She needed a moment so grand, so talked about, that Mrs. Astor herself could not ignore it. That moment became the famous Vanderbilt Costume Ball of 1883, the event that changed New York society forever. It was the social explosion of the century. Invitations were sought with desperation, whispered about in backrooms, and hoarded like royal decrees. The city buzzed with rumors, the guest list, the gowns, the decorations, the unimaginable cost. Newspapers breathlessly speculated, and even skeptics admitted that nothing like it had ever been attempted. Inside the Vanderbilt ballroom, guests arrived in elaborate themed costumes: queens, knights, Renaissance nobles, mythological figures. Diamonds draped over gowns, feathers soared above hairstyles, gold threads glittered beneath gaslight. The spectacle was so overwhelming that even the most reserved old money families were forced to concede its magnificence. And most importantly, Mrs. Astor was not invited, not at first. She had never called on Alva. She had never acknowledged the Vanderbilts as equals, and in Alva's world, respect had to be mutual. When Mrs. Astor heard she had been excluded, she sent her calling card, the ultimate symbol of acceptance. In return, Alva sent the invitation. The ball was a triumph. It cracked New York's rigid social hierarchy wide open. The Vanderbilts were no longer outsiders, they were leaders. Alva had forced the old guard to recognize what they had tried so desperately to deny. Wealth was power, and the Vanderbilts had more of it than anyone. But for Alva and her family, this victory was just the beginning. New York might have been the battlefield, but there was another stage rising, a place where the wealthy escaped the city's summer heat, and where status could be broadcast on a much grander scale. That place was Newport, Rhode Island. Unlike New York's tight, suffocating drawing rooms, Newport offered a blank canvas. Families built mansions that were anything but modest, seaside palaces designed not only for comfort, but for display. The Cliffs became a gallery of ambition. Each summer brought new expansions, new gardens, new ballrooms, each family trying to outshine the next in an ever-intensifying contest. Here, the Vanderbilts found the perfect arena to secure their dominance. Their wealth allowed them to construct houses that dwarfed those of their rivals. Their architects had access to every stone, every artisan, every imported luxury. And their name, once dismissed as too new, too industrial, too loud, now carried the weight of inevitability. Newport wasn't just a retreat, it was the proving ground for America's elite, and it was where the Vanderbilts would cement their place in history. For within a few years, the Cliffs of Newport would witness the rise of a mansion that embodied the full force of their ambition, the Breakers. But before that palace could rise, the family would have to endure a devastating night, a fire that would destroy everything they had built, and ignite a determination to rebuild something even greater, something indestructible. Before the Breakers became the legendary stone palace that stands today, there was another house on that same cliff, a quieter, more intimate mansion built during the Vanderbilts' first steps into Newport society. It wasn't the colossal landmark millions now know. It didn't tower with marble columns or echo with the weight of dynastic ambition. But in its time, the original Breakers was a symbol of something the Vanderbilts had spent decades fighting for: social belonging. Cornelius Vanderbilt II purchased the property in 1885, during a moment when his family's social star was finally rising. The success of Alva Vanderbilt's spectacle-filled strategy in New York had opened doors that had long been locked. And Newport, with its sweeping breezes and cliffside estates, was quickly becoming the summer capital of privilege. If one wished to be recognized among the elite, one needed a presence here, not a rented cottage, not an understated villa, but a home whose very facade announced one's arrival. The original Breakers, designed by the architect Peabody and Stearns, was exactly that. It blended Queen Anne and French Chateau influences, tall gables, wide verandas, and ornamental woodwork that seemed almost delicate against the roar of the Atlantic below. Though modest compared to what would replace it, the house still carried the unmistakable air of luxury associated with the Vanderbilt name. It had over 30 rooms, terraces facing the sea, and gardens that cascaded down toward the cliffs. It was elegant, grand, and unmistakably fashionable, the kind of summer residence that reflected both taste and status. Inside, the atmosphere was softer than the gilt-laden interiors that would later define the Gilded Age. The rooms were filled with polished wood, patterned wallpapers, and richly upholstered furniture. Sunlight filtered through tall windows in the morning, warming the polished floors. Evenings brought the sound of the surf colliding with the rocks, echoing through open doors as lamps flickered along the hallways. It had the warm, lived-in feel of a home rather than a palace. It was a sanctuary. For Cornelius and his wife Alice, this house represented more than a place to escape New York's relentless heat. It was proof, visible, tangible proof, that their family had earned a place among America's social aristocracy. The Vanderbilts were no longer the newly rich upstarts fighting for invitations. They were part of the world they had once been denied. Summers at the original Breakers were lively, filled with family gatherings, long dinners, and bicycle rides along Newport's winding coastal roads. The Vanderbilt children, still young then, ran across the lawns, climbed the rocks near the cliffside, and explored the gardens without the rigid formality that governed their winters in the city. Cornelius himself found relief here. Although burdened by the immense responsibility of managing the Vanderbilt fortune and the New York Central Railroad, Newport allowed him a measure of peace. Mornings might begin with business letters and telegrams, but afternoons were spent on the veranda, overlooking the sea. The house also played a strategic social role. Newport society was competitive, but it was also intimate. Invitations were currency, and the right gathering could shift alliances and reputations. The Breakers quickly became a favored place for hosting these moments. Its drawing rooms filled with the hum of conversation, the rustle of dresses, the quiet clink of silver. Prominent families who once hesitated to acknowledge the Vanderbilts found themselves charmed by the hospitality and grace of Cornelius and Alice. Step by step, event by event, the mansion helped solidify the family's position among the Newport elite. Yet unlike the monumental structure that would stand later, the first Breakers had an underlying vulnerability. Its beauty rested on timber and shingles, not stone. The fireplaces were built into wooden walls, the attics were lined with dry beams. It was by its nature fragile, no matter how wealthy the family who owned it. But fragility was not something the Vanderbilts considered. The house had been built quickly, in the fashion of the time, and it served its purpose well. It stood proudly on the cliffs, its silhouette recognizable from the ocean. For several years, it was the heart of the Vanderbilt summers, a place of joy, accomplishment, and inclusion. It was also a symbol of a transformation that had reshaped New York's social order. With the original Breakers, the Vanderbilts had finally achieved what generations had sought: acceptance. No one knew that this fragile wooden masterpiece, built as an announcement of arrival, would soon vanish in a blaze so fierce it would leave nothing but ashes, and spark a determination to build something far greater. Because long before the Breakers became a monument to indestructibility, it existed as a dream fulfilled, a dream that would burn to the ground in a matter of hours. The night the first Breakers fell began like any other quiet summer evening on the Newport cliffs. The sea breeze rolled in over the rocks, carrying the scent of salt and the rhythmic crash of waves. Inside the wooden mansion, lamps glowed softly, and the last of the servants finished their duties for the night. Nothing hinted at the catastrophe that would strike before dawn, a disaster so swift and devastating that it would erase the Vanderbilt home in less time than it took to build a single room. Sometime after midnight, smoke began to curl through the servants' quarters. It rose quietly at first, almost unnoticed, as if it were part of the evening mist. But within minutes the soft haze transformed into a choking cloud. Curtains sparked, wooden beams crackled. By the time the first alarm was raised, a frantic shout echoing through the hallways, the fire had already taken hold. Eyewitness accounts from that night describe a scene that moved with terrifying speed. The original Breakers, built of timber and ornamented with delicate woodwork, burned like a matchstick struck against stone. Flames raced up staircases, down corridors, and across ceilings. The dry coastal air fed the blaze. Every gust of wind from the Atlantic acted like a blacksmith's bellows, forcing the fire to stretch wider, brighter, more violently. Servants rushed through hallways thick with smoke, banging on doors, waking those still asleep. Some ran barefoot across the lawns, coughing and shouting warnings to anyone inside. Others struggled to salvage what little they could, a portrait here, a piece of silver there, before heat forced them back. Outside, witnesses later recalled hearing windows burst from the pressure inside the house, sending shards of glass scattering across the grass. By the time the flames broke through the roof, the fire had turned the entire mansion into a towering beacon visible from miles away. Residents along the Newport shore woke to the glow on their bedroom walls. A few hurried toward the cliffs, hoping to help, though nothing could be done. There were no municipal fire hydrants nearby, and the engines of the era were slow, powerless against a structure already consumed. The ocean roared behind the house, but the water might as well have been 1,000 miles away. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was in New York when he received the news. A messenger arrived breathless in the early hours to report the blaze. By then it was already too late. The first breakers was lost. No frantic telegram, no hurried carriage ride, no wealth or influence could change it. Reports say that when the message reached him, Cornelius sat silently for a long moment, unable to speak. The house had been more than a summer retreat. It was a symbol of the family's hard-won legitimacy, a physical representation of everything the Vanderbilts had achieved. To have it erased in a single night felt like a cruel reversal of fortune. As dawn broke, the mansion was little more than a smoking heap of charred timbers and collapsed chimneys. The once elegant verandas were gone. Windows that once framed ocean views now gaped open like empty eye sockets. The gardens were littered with ash. The heat from the blaze had scorched nearby trees, leaving them black and skeletal. Neighbors who approached the ruins that morning described an eerie stillness, the kind of silence that follows only after something immense has ended. The air was heavy with the scent of burnt cedar and salt. Servants stood in clusters, stunned, some weeping openly. They had lost not only their workplace but the rhythm of their summers, the security of their routines. The Vanderbilt family arrived soon after, each member confronting the destruction in stunned disbelief. For Cornelius and Alice, the loss carried emotional and symbolic weight. This was the home where they had entertained the very families who once refused to accept them. It was where their children had played on the lawns, and where their summers had taken on a sense of ease rarely found in their demanding lives. Everything familiar, every room, every memory, every mark of their arrival among Newport's elite now smoldered at their feet. Yet out of this devastation came a change in Cornelius that would alter the family legacy forever. Standing before the ruins, he made a decision with startling clarity. The new house would not simply replace the old one, it would eclipse it. It would be stronger, grander, untouchable. No flame, no storm, no accident would ever threaten it again. If the first breakers was the symbol of the Vanderbilts' acceptance, the next one would be a monument to their permanence. The fire that destroyed the original mansion ignited something far greater, a determination to build a palace unlike anything America had ever seen. A house not made of wood and ornament, but of stone, steel, and architectural brilliance. A house that would not merely stand on the cliffs of Newport, but command them. In the ashes of that terrible night, the blueprint for the new breakers took shape. What had been lost would be reborn stronger, more magnificent, and destined to outlive every member of the family who built it. The disaster that should have humbled the Vanderbilts became the very force that solidified their legacy, and from those ruins, the most famous mansion in America would rise. The morning after the fire, as the smoke still curled above the ruined timbers, Cornelius Vanderbilt II stood at the edge of the blackened foundation and made a promise to himself and to Newport. The tragedy that had reduced his family's summer retreat to ash would not be the end of the breakers. It would be the beginning of something far greater. If the first house had been a symbol of arrival, the next would be a monument of permanence. The flames that consumed the cottage had also consumed the last traces of hesitation in him. What he built now would not, could not, ever be destroyed again. Cornelius had always carried the weight of being the responsible Vanderbilt, the heir chosen to maintain the empire his father and grandfather had built. The fire felt personal, almost like a challenge. He refused to let misfortune decide the legacy of his branch of the family. Instead, he would reclaim that narrative brick by brick, stone by stone. The new breakers would prove that the Vanderbilts were not merely wealthy, they were enduring. There was only one man in America who could turn that ambition into stone, Richard Morris Hunt. Hunt was not just an architect, he was the architect, the first American trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the visionary who had introduced Europe's classical languages of architecture to the United States. He had already designed palaces for Cornelius's siblings, including Marble House for William K. Vanderbilt, an $11 million temple of French opulence that had stunned Newport society. Hunt understood the language of grandeur. He understood spectacle, and most importantly, he understood what the Vanderbilts wanted to say through architecture. So when Cornelius approached him about rebuilding the breakers, Hunt immediately grasped the magnitude of what was being asked. This was not a simple rebuild. It was a reimagining, a declaration that American wealth could match the magnificence of Europe's aristocratic estates, and it had to be fireproof. That requirement alone made the project revolutionary. In an age when most mansions were elaborate compositions of wood and plaster, Cornelius demanded steel, stone, and marble, no timber framing, no hidden structural wood. Every beam, every support, every floor had to be built with materials that flames could not touch. The trauma of the fire had carved this into him. He would never again watch his home burn. Hunt accepted the challenge with the enthusiasm of a man given the chance to create his masterpiece. From the beginning, he envisioned the breakers not as an American imitation of European architecture, but as a palace that would stand confidently beside the great Renaissance residences of Italy. To find inspiration, he studied the 16th-century palazzos of Genoa and Turin, buildings designed to impress visiting dignitaries and intimidate political rivals. These palaces shared several defining traits: symmetrical facades, classical columns, grand loggias, high arched windows, vast central courts. Hunt took these elements and reinterpreted them for a cliffside mansion overlooking the Atlantic. The new breakers would be shaped by Renaissance ideals but built with American industrial power. It would combine old-world grace with new-world strength, a marriage of art and engineering. Cornelius agreed wholeheartedly. This was precisely the statement he wanted the new house to make. The Vanderbilts were not simply recreating European aristocracy, they were surpassing it through innovation. America, through its wealth and ambition, could build something even the Medici would envy. Then came the practical question: how long would such a palace take to build? Normally, a residence of that scale, especially with fireproof engineering, would require at least 5 years. Hunt, however, was given just 2. Cornelius wanted the house ready for the summer season of 1895. That meant an unprecedented pace of design, planning, and construction. Hunt assembled a monumental team of draftsmen, engineers, and artisans. Plans were sketched, revised, approved, and redrawn with astonishing speed. Dozens of craftsmen in Europe began working simultaneously to create individual rooms that would later be shipped to America like giant jigsaw pieces. The estimated budget was staggering, over $7 million, more than any private home in America had ever cost. Adjusted for today, that exceeds $240 million. Cornelius approved it without hesitation. This was legacy spending. This was history spending. The Vanderbilt name would be carved in stone, not simply recited in business ledgers. Hunt's preliminary plans were completed in record time. The design centered around a great hall nearly 50 feet high, inspired by Renaissance courtyards but enclosed to suit Newport's climate. Surrounding it would be reception rooms, music rooms, dining rooms, and vast galleries, each decorated with materials sourced from around the world. The bedrooms would occupy the second floor, elegant but less ostentatious, while the servants' quarters would be tucked discreetly in the upper floors. Everything from the limestone facade to the roof trusses would be fireproof. Even the boilers would be placed underground, entirely detached from the main structure, encased in brick vaults so that nothing inside the house could ever ignite again. Cornelius reviewed the plans with a mixture of grief and determination. The fire was still fresh in his memory, but the vision of what would replace the ashes filled him with a kind of awe. What he and Hunt were attempting was more than architectural restoration, it was architectural resurrection. In the spring of 1893, the first foundation stones were laid. Hunt stood by the cliffs, studying the site, watching teams of workers begin the excavation. Cornelius visited frequently, inspecting progress with quiet intensity. Every block of limestone that arrived from Indiana, every steel beam set into place, every carved ornament shipped from Europe became part of a shared mission, the creation of a palace that would resist time, fire, and fate. This was not revenge against the disaster that destroyed the first breakers. It was triumph over it. Cornelius Vanderbilt II was building a house so strong, so magnificent, so meticulously engineered that nothing, not even the kind of catastrophe that had humbled him once, could touch it again. The breakers would rise as the greatest private residence America had ever seen, a palace born from ashes, a monument meant to last forever. Before the first limestone block was hoisted into place, before the great hall soared toward its painted sky, before the chandeliers glittered above polished marble floors, the breakers existed only as a vision in the minds of Cornelius Vanderbilt II and Richard Morris Hunt. To turn that vision into reality required something neither of them could supply: the labor of thousands of workers whose names would never appear in any society column. Their hands shaped the palace, their sweat filled its foundations, and their sacrifices made the Vanderbilt dream possible. The breakers was built not by millionaires, but by immigrants. From the very beginning, the construction site resembled a small city. By summer 1893, as many as 2,000 workers were laboring around the clock. Newport had never seen anything like it. Entire teams were dedicated to excavation alone, carving deep into the rocky cliff to create a foundation strong enough to hold a mansion made almost entirely of stone and steel. Steam-powered cranes swung overhead. Carts rattled along temporary tracks. The air vibrated with the clang of hammers, the grind of saws, and the shouts of foremen trying to impose order on an industrial symphony. At the center of it all was the workforce, mostly immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Germany, and Eastern Europe, joined by local laborers who saw the project as a rare chance for steady pay during a volatile economic era. Many of the Italian workers were skilled stonemasons who had brought centuries-old craft traditions with them across the Atlantic. They were the artists behind the mansion's most intricate details: carved columns, floral reliefs, ornamental cornices, and the delicate stonework framing the arched windows. These men arrived at dawn 6 days a week. Their workdays often stretched from sunrise to sunset, totaling 70 hours or more. Pay hovered around $1.50 to $2 per day, depending on skill, hardly enough to support a family, especially in a resort town that catered to the ultra-rich. Yet the artists and laborers persevered, carving and shaping limestone blocks under the watchful eyes of architects and contractors. They knew their craftsmanship was creating something extraordinary, even if they would never be permitted through the front doors as guests. Inside the shell of the growing mansion, teams of artisans set to work installing the materials Hunt had sourced from across the globe. Italian marble arrived by ship, then by rail, then by wagon, and finally by hand into the heart of the building. African marbles, French panels, and Spanish leather passed through the same chain of labor. Nothing moved without human effort. The music room, destined to be lined with platinum, was built in France by Allard and Sons, then carefully disassembled and shipped in crates. When those crates arrived in Newport, French craftsmen painstakingly reassembled the pieces like an enormous puzzle. Every panel had been numbered. Every joint had been measured down to fractions of an inch. Watching them rebuild the room felt like witnessing a violinist restring a priceless instrument. Meanwhile, teams of steelworkers erected the skeleton of the palace. Their work was dangerous, performed high above the ground without modern safety equipment. They balanced on beams no wider than their boots, guiding red-hot rivets into place as foremen shouted instructions over the wind and crashing waves below. Injuries were common, compensation was minimal, and death, when it happened, was spoken of quietly, the price of grand ambition. No one in the Vanderbilt household ever knew the names of the men who risked their lives to install the very steel beams that kept the palace standing. Beneath the surface, another layer of labor unfolded. Plumbers, electricians, and boilermen worked in the underbelly of the mansion, installing innovative systems that would make the breakers modern for its time. The plumbing system, which included rooftop cisterns feeding fresh and heated seawater, was cutting edge. Electricians wired miles of copper through walls and ceilings to power chandeliers and sconces while also installing gas fixtures as backup. These tradesmen often worked in cramped spaces where ventilation was limited and temperatures soared. All of this unfolded while Newport society watched from a distance, fascinated by the scale of the project, but untouched by the hardship that fueled it. In town, laborers boarded in overcrowded tenements, sending wages home to families in Italy or living frugally so they could eventually bring those families to America. Workers often lived 8 or 10 to a room, their paychecks disappearing into rent and food long before any savings could be set aside. Yet despite the harsh realities, there was pride, real pride, among the men who worked on the breakers. They knew the magnitude of what they were creating. When the limestone facade rose above the trees, they saw their craft in every curve and every detail. The breakers was not just a job, it was an achievement, a permanent marker of their place in the American story, even if history rarely acknowledges them. As the months passed, the mansion began to take shape. Columns emerged from scaffolding, window frames were installed, and interior rooms filled with light through the cavernous Great Hall. Workers moved like ants through a kingdom they were building for others, and yet they were its lifeblood. Without them, the breakers would have been nothing more than ink on Hunt's architectural drawings. By the end of 1894, the palace was nearly enclosed. By early 1895, plasterers, painters, and finish carpenters filled the interior, each adding their layer to the monument. Hunt oversaw the smallest details. Vanderbilt inspected progress with the gravity of a man whose fortune and pride were on the line. The mansion that would one day symbolize the heights of American aristocracy was born from the hands of people society never invited to its tables. Their work built the walls, carved the stone, and polished the floors that would soon welcome the country's wealthiest families. The breakers was a triumph of architecture. But it was also a testament to labor, to 2,000 workers whose strength and sweat transformed limestone and steel into the most iconic palace of the Gilded Age. To step inside the breakers for the first time was to be swallowed whole by a world that did not belong to ordinary America. Nothing about it felt domestic, familiar, or even remotely human in scale. It was not a home. It was a declaration. A statement of supremacy carved in marble, draped in platinum, and suspended beneath ceilings painted to mimic the heavens themselves. This was the Palace Cornelius Vanderbilt II, built to ensure no one, not a single rival family in Newport or New York, would ever question the power of his name again. The front doors opened into the Great Hall, a space designed to humble even the wealthiest visitor. Rising nearly 50 feet, the hall felt like the interior courtyard of a Renaissance palazzo. Light poured in through towering arched windows. The marble underfoot, cool, polished, reflecting glimmers of afternoon sun stretched in every direction. Every detail was intentional. The columns were carved from rare stone. The capitals shimmered with gold. The ceiling, painted with drifting clouds, created the illusion of open sky. Here, guests entering during the Newport season would pause involuntarily as the room confronted them. The Vanderbilts' social superiority was not stated. It was felt physically in the sheer verticality of the space. The Grand Hall was more than a room. It was a stage, and every summer the entire elite of America walked across it. The music room, platinum walls, and imported perfection through a set of massive doors lay one of the most extraordinary rooms in any American residence, the music room. Unlike other rooms, this chamber was not constructed in Newport. It was built in France, every panel, molding, and detail, by the Atelier Allard & Sons. When it was complete, the French craftsmen labeled each piece, packed them into crates, and shipped them across the Atlantic like treasure. Inside the breakers, they reassembled the room by hand, aligning each numbered element with mathematical precision. And the walls, they glowed, not with gold, but with platinum leaf. Alice Vanderbilt insisted on platinum because she found gold too vulgar for a room intended for refined gatherings. Recitals, waltzes, poetry, evenings designed to broadcast elegance rather than excess. The chandeliers were baccarat crystal, the furnishings imported, the acoustics engineered so that a single violin could fill the space without effort. It was a room for music, yes, but more than that, it was a room that announced, we are not merely wealthy, we define taste. Opposite the music room, the dining room stretched nearly 60 feet in length, rising 2 full stories. Guests who sat at its long mahogany table found themselves dwarfed by alabaster columns carved by Italian masters, coffered ceilings painted and gilded massive fireplaces taller than most men, crystal chandeliers designed to hold hundreds of candles, later electrified. The effect was overwhelming. Dinner here did not resemble a meal. It resembled a ceremony. Floral arrangements towered over the table. Footmen moved silently along the perimeter. The Vanderbilts presided like royalty. This was a room where deals were made, alliances reinforced, reputations cemented. Every guest invited understood the privilege and the message of being seated beneath those chandeliers. If the music room declared refinement, the dining room declared dominance. The loggia, the Atlantic as a backdrop, few spaces in the house captured the fantasy of the Gilded Age like the ocean-facing loggia. It opened directly onto cliffs overlooking the Atlantic. The sound of crashing waves filled the air. Salt swept through the arches, mingling with the scent of marble warmed by the sun. Here, the family would take breakfast or entertain small gatherings during the summer months. Surrounded by carved stone columns, guests looked out over a view that no European palace could replicate. This was America's wealth meeting America's landscape. The Vanderbilts were not imitating European aristocracy. They were surpassing it. The loggia made that point vividly. While the grand spaces belonged to society, one room belonged almost entirely to Alice Vanderbilt herself, the morning room. It was here she wrote correspondence, managed household operations, planned parties and guest lists, received close friends. Unlike the platinum and alabaster elsewhere, this room was gentler. Walls were covered in embossed Spanish leather with gold patterns. The fireplace mantel came from a 16th-century French chateau. Furniture was delicate, almost feminine. In a house built as a monument, this was the most human space, calm, refined, composed. It reflected Alice's discipline and the standards she maintained for herself and her family. If the morning room carried Alice's signature, the billiard room carried Cornelius's. Here, the color palette shifted. Deep green marble walls, mosaic floors hand-laid by Italian artisans, carved woodwork, heavy, masculine furniture. Cornelius allowed no smoking here, an unusual prohibition for the era. He preferred the space clean, the air clear, the atmosphere focused. This was where deals were discussed quietly, where Cornelius entertained fellow industrialists or escaped from the constant demands of the railroad empire. The room represented efficiency, discipline, and the seriousness with which Cornelius approached his responsibilities. The second floor housed the family's private suites, each a world of ritual and refinement. An oval masterpiece with 4 closets, silk-covered walls, elaborate moldings, a private dressing room, a paging system to summon maids. Alice changed outfits as many as 7 times per day during the season. Her bedroom was not merely a place to sleep, it was the command center of a social empire. By contrast, his room was almost austere, walnut paneling, a modest fireplace, practical furnishings. It reflected his workhorse mentality, his obsession with duty over display. Each was decorated in a different European style. Louis XV, Renaissance Revival, Neoclassical, nothing repeated, no expense spared. Guests stayed in rooms that rivaled the finest hotels. And yet the real luxury was invisible. Behind the opulent spaces lay another world entirely, an architectural underbelly designed to ensure servants were seen only when required. Narrow passageways ran behind the great rooms. Hidden staircases connected floors vertically. Dumbwaiters transported food and linens silently. Call buttons allowed staff to appear within seconds. Servants could move through the house without ever crossing a family path. It was a system built for perfection, smooth, silent, invisible. Every square foot of the breakers was engineered to communicate one thing: the scale of rooms, the imported materials, the engineering innovations, the art, the marble, the platinum, the ocean views, all of it was symbol, not shelter. The breakers was the architectural equivalent of a coronation robe, lavish, impractical, unforgettable. And it worked. The palace became the crown jewel of Newport. The final word in Gilded Age splendor, a home built not to be lived in but to be remembered. Inside the breakers, life did not flow the way it did in ordinary households. It didn't even resemble the rhythms of other wealthy families. The mansion operated like a court, a miniature aristocracy where every movement, every visitor, every hour of the day followed its own rules, a choreography of privilege held together by etiquette, hierarchy, and performance. This was not simply a summer home. It was the Vanderbilt throne room. For 8 weeks every summer, the family fell into a schedule that balanced leisure with the theatrics of high society. Mornings began quietly. Alice Vanderbilt would retreat to the morning room with correspondence, household ledgers, and invitations. Breakfast arrived on silver trays. Servants moved silently, disappearing behind hidden doors before the family even looked up. The children, those who remained living, passed through the house with tutors, companions, and governesses guiding their routines. Lessons in French, piano practice, riding along the cliff walk. Their days were designed to prepare them for life in the same world that had crowned their parents. Cornelius, when he was well enough in the earlier years, would walk the loggia overlooking the Atlantic or entertain guests in the billiard room. But the true force of the household was Alice. She understood what the breakers represented, she understood its demands, and she upheld its rituals with a queen's precision. Etiquette, the unwritten constitution to survive in Gilded Age society, required mastery of a complex, unspoken code. The rules didn't exist on paper, yet they governed everything. Guests arrived at specific hours, walked through specific doors, sat in specific chairs, left at specific times. Ladies changed outfits multiple times per day: morning attire, visiting dress, afternoon tea gown, dinner gown, post-dinner gown. Even the wrong fabric at the wrong hour could signal ignorance. Dining followed strict traditions. The seating chart reflected rank. Conversation topics were predetermined. Servants rotated through courses with clockwork precision. Dessert was served only after the hostess gave an almost invisible cue at the breakers. These rules weren't just observed, they were perfected. Alice had spent decades mastering the social constitution of New York and Newport. In her home, etiquette wasn't a formality. It was a weapon, a way to establish authority not through aggression but through impeccable control. Newport's social calendar existed for one purpose: competition. The Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, the Ulrichs, they battled each other not in business but in spectacle, and at the heart of this battle stood the breakers. In July and August, the mansion transformed into a stage set for the Gilded Age's most extravagant performances: balls that lasted past midnight, opera recitals in the music room, dinners where each course arrived like a ceremony. Footmen lined the walls in perfect formation. Florists delivered hundreds of roses each week. Musicians filled the halls with waltzes and chamber music that drifted through corridors like perfume. Guests moved through the Great Hall as if floating: chiffon, silk, diamonds catching light from chandeliers crafted in France. Champagne glasses sparkled. Laughter rose beneath ceilings painted to resemble the heavens. At the breakers, extravagance was not indulgence, it was strategy. Every party reaffirmed the Vanderbilt name. Every guest witnessed a display of permanence and dominion. This was not entertainment, this was branding. Who was allowed and who was not. The most important part of Newport society wasn't who attended these gatherings, but who wasn't invited at all. Membership in the upper circle was tightly guarded. Being wealthy wasn't enough. New money industrialists could buy diamonds, estates, even European titles, but they couldn't buy acceptance. The Vanderbilts themselves had learned that lesson the hard way in their early years. At the breakers, entry was granted only to those who met the standards of lineage, respectability, and most importantly, strategic usefulness. A single misstep, a scandal, an inappropriate marriage, a failed business could exile a family from invitations for an entire season. Some were quietly excised. Others were intentionally humiliated by being seated poorly or invited last minute. The breakers functioned like a filter, the velvet rope of America's aristocracy. And Alice was its gatekeeper. To call the breakers a mansion is to misunderstand it. It was closer to a court, and Alice Vanderbilt was its sovereign. Every detail of the palace reinforced the hierarchy. Guests entered through the monumental hall, announcing their arrival like courtiers. The music room framed the hostess like a queen's audience. Chamber, the dining room, was a ceremonial arena. The loggia served as a royal balcony. Even the gardens were arranged to guide visitors through a carefully designed narrative of wealth in this world. Architecture was power. Ritual was authority. Elegance was influence. The Vanderbilt name echoed through every marble corridor. For 8 weeks each year, the breakers didn't just host Newport's elite, it ruled them. And although the Gilded Age would eventually collapse under the weight of income tax, market crashes, and shifting culture, the memory of these summers, these theatrical, magnificent, strategically orchestrated summers, would remain carved into history. The breakers was not merely where the Vanderbilts lived, it was where they reigned. The breakers dazzled guests with marble, crystal, and ceilings painted like Renaissance heavens. But beneath the splendor, beneath the gold and the platinum walls, the true engine of the mansion operated in silence. It was a world most visitors never saw, a world of narrow corridors, small rooms tucked beneath the eaves, and human beings whose lives were defined by duty, exhaustion, and invisibility. The Vanderbilts lived in a palace. Their servants lived in its shadows. The hierarchy of labor inside the breakers was rigid, precise, and unforgiving. At the top stood the housekeeper, the quiet general who oversaw everything from pantry inventories to the placement of flowers in the music room. Below her stood butlers, footmen, ladies' maids, chefs, laundresses, valets, chambermaids, groomsmen, furnacemen, and stable hands. For every glamorous task that impressed a guest, a dozen unseen tasks kept the illusion alive. Servants rose before dawn, long before ocean light touched the cliffs of Newport. By 5:00 a.m., the first fires had to be lit in the boilers, the kitchens awakened, the floors swept, the brass polished until it gleamed like new coin. Breakfast trays were prepared upstairs, fresh linens laid, fruit cut, tea brewed precisely to each family member's preference. Linen maids checked rooms, footmen stood ready, and coachmen tended to the horses long before anyone in the Vanderbilt family stirred from sleep. Every task had a rule, every movement a protocol. A footman was trained to walk soundlessly. A chambermaid was expected to vanish if a family member entered the hallway. Servants learned to communicate with glances, nods, or barely perceptible motions. Sound was reserved for the family. Silence was the servant's language. Most of these workers came from immigrant families, Irish, Italian, German, Polish, seeking wages that might lift siblings or children out of poverty. Many had arrived in America with a single trunk, only to find themselves sleeping in cramped attic rooms on the breakers' 4th floor. 33 small bedrooms lined the uppermost corridor, each scarcely large enough for a bed, a dresser, and a single window. The heat rose in summer, froze in winter, but no servant complained. Complaints meant replacement, and replacement meant hunger. Their letters, the few that survive, tell a story far removed from the glamour of Newport. A chambermaid wrote to her sister in Boston, "The rooms are so fine I daren't breathe when cleaning them. I walk like I'm on glass. Mrs. V expects perfection, and the housekeeper sees everything." Another note from a young footman to his parents in Ireland captures the pressure of working under a dynasty obsessed with appearances. "We serve dinner like soldiers. It must look as if no work is being done at all, as if plates change themselves." The most revealing accounts came from the laundry workers, whose days were the longest of all. They washed delicate fabrics, expensive linens, and gowns worth more than their yearly wages. Steam filled the basement where they worked. By 9:00 p.m., they often had piles remaining, and some slept in the laundry room itself, waking again before sunrise to finish what they left undone. Meals for the servants were plain: bread, porridge, stew if they were lucky. While guests feasted under crystal chandeliers on multi-course dinners served with theatrical timing, the workers ate quickly in a small dining room in the basement because there was always another bell to answer, another room to prepare, another demand to meet. The breakers operated on a system of hidden passages that allowed servants to move undetected throughout the mansion. Behind the grand hall, behind the dining room, behind the music room, narrow service corridors lined the walls like arterial veins. Servants memorized their layouts. Their job was not simply to work but to disappear. A well-run household, in the eyes of the Vanderbilts, was one where no servant was ever seen or heard unless summoned. It is easy to imagine the breakers during a lavish summer ball, music swelling, gowns glittering, champagne flowing. But behind those scenes was a choreography far more complex than anything happening under the chandeliers. Footmen carried trays up and down staircase after staircase. Maids replaced candles and polished mirrors smudged by guests. Cooks sweated in the stifling heat of the kitchens preparing courses timed to the second. And on the fourth floor, servants not on shift lay exhausted on narrow beds, listening to the muted hum of celebration below, a world they served but could never join. Still, many felt pride in the place they worked. The Breakers was a palace unlike any other in America. To serve there, even invisibly, meant good wages and a certain prestige among domestic staff. Some stayed for decades, devoting the prime of their lives to maintaining a mansion whose beauty they admired from a distance. Others left worn down by the endless demands and the unrelenting pace. What united them all was this: their world existed so that another world could shine without effort. The grandeur above depended on the sacrifice below. Every polished marble floor, every flawless dinner service, every room that glittered effortlessly was made possible by hands that remained unseen. Beneath the chandeliers, the servants' footprints were erased daily, their fingerprints wiped away, their presence unacknowledged. Yet without them, the Breakers would have been nothing but a shell, a palace unable to function, unable to breathe, unable to masquerade as effortless luxury. The Gilded Age is often remembered for its gold, its glamour, its dazzling excess. But the true story, the whole story, includes the people buried in its shadows, whose labor carved the path that others walked like royalty. The Breakers was their world, too. Only it was a world they were never meant to inhabit, only to sustain. The Breakers had barely entered its glory years when the shadows began to gather. For a single summer, in 1895, Cornelius Vanderbilt II walked its halls in full health, watching guests marvel at the palace he had willed into existence. He stood on the loggia overlooking the Atlantic, convinced he had built something that would endure for generations. But the house that symbolized triumph would soon become the place where decline quietly took root. The strain of managing the vast Vanderbilt railroad empire had been accumulating for years. Cornelius had inherited more than fortune. He had inherited responsibility so heavy it bent the spine of every man who held it. Endless decisions, labor strikes, government pressure, rival railroads scheming for advantage, and beneath it all, the unspoken demand that he sustain the wealth his father and grandfather had created from nothing. He carried that burden with the kind of stoic discipline his family admired. He rose early, worked relentlessly, returned late, and pushed himself past every limit. But the body has its own arithmetic, and it inevitably comes due. In the spring of 1896, just months after settling into the Breakers, Cornelius suffered a stroke. One moment he was reviewing documents in his New York office. The next he had collapsed, his right side partially paralyzed. The man who had managed an empire could barely lift his hand. Doctors urged rest. Newport sea air was considered restorative, so Alice brought him back to the Breakers, the palace he had built to symbolize strength, now serving as his refuge in weakness. Servants helped him move through rooms that had once filled him with pride. He sat on the loggia wrapped in blankets, watching waves crash against the cliffs, unable to walk without assistance. He had imagined spending decades here. Instead, he spent his recovery quietly observing the house that would outlive him. Through the summers of 1897 and 1898, Cornelius recovered some mobility, but never his former vigor. He appeared at dinners occasionally, offering a faint smile, his once commanding posture replaced by a gentler uncertainty. Guests whispered respectfully. Everyone sensed what no one dared to say aloud. The strongest Vanderbilt of his generation was fading. The family felt the shift deeply. For Alice, the decline of her husband carried a double grief: the loss of the man she had stood beside for decades, and the collapse of the life they had built together. Their children watched their father's silence grow longer, his steps slower, his presence dimmer. Even the servants moved through the corridors with a softer tread. In September 1899, after briefly returning to New York to attend a meeting at the railroad office, Cornelius woke before dawn with a dreadful clarity. He told Alice, "I think I am dying." Minutes later, he suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. The man who had built America's most magnificent mansion, a palace meant to last forever, was gone at just 55. News of his death swept through Newport and New York with somber reverence. Flags were lowered. Railroad offices paused their operations. Newspapers declared the end of an era. But no public gesture compared to the personal devastation inside the Breakers. Alice returned to Newport a widow, walking through the palace her husband had created as a statement of power, now transformed into a monument to loss. The great hall's soaring ceilings echoed differently. The morning room, where she had once coordinated summer events, became a place of quiet mourning. The bedroom that Cornelius had occupied only briefly stood frozen in time, a reminder that he had enjoyed the castle he built for only a heartbeat. His death changed the meaning of the mansion. What had been a symbol of arrival now became a reminder of fragility. What had been a victory over the social elite now became a shadowed inheritance. The Breakers was still magnificent, still overwhelming, but its marble seemed colder, its grandeur heavier. In the summers that followed, the family returned, but the energy had shifted. Alice, determined and disciplined, kept the house running, preserving Cornelius's legacy with an almost sacred devotion. But beneath the rituals of high society and the facade of perfection, a quiet truth lingered. The Breakers had been built to withstand fire, storms, and the passage of time, but it could not withstand fate. It could not protect the family from illness, tragedy, or the slow unraveling of fortune. Its walls stood unchanged, but the people who had given it meaning were slipping away. Cornelius Vanderbilt II had built a palace meant to secure his name for centuries. Instead, it became a testament to how quickly even the most powerful dynasties can find themselves standing at the edge of decline. After Cornelius Vanderbilt II's death, the Breakers stood untouched, a marble cliffside giant frozen in the height of the Gilded Age. But outside its limestone walls, the world was shifting. The very forces that had created this palace, railroads, tariffs, monopoly profits, and industrial expansion, were beginning to crumble. What no one inside the Vanderbilt family understood yet was that the Breakers was headed for a crisis far greater than fire, the collapse of the fortune that built it. At the turn of the 20th century, the Vanderbilt wealth looked invincible. The family controlled major rail lines from New York to the Midwest, collecting enormous profits from freight, passengers, and the economic arteries of the nation. These were not just businesses, they were the lifeblood of American commerce. As long as trains ran, the Vanderbilt fortune flourished. But by the 1910s and 1920s, the railroad empire faced threats on every front. Automobiles gave the public independence, trucks stole freight business, buses replaced passenger routes, and airplanes arrived as symbols of modernity. The New York Central Railroad, once the pride of the family, was suddenly outdated. Its revenues weakened. Stock dividends, once the fuel for Vanderbilt lifestyles, began to shrink. For a family whose identity was built on the assumption of endless wealth, this was more than an economic shift. It was an existential one. Then came another blow, the federal income tax. In 1913, the 16th Amendment was ratified, introducing a permanent federal tax on personal income. For ordinary Americans, this meant little, but for families like the Vanderbilts, whose incomes were astronomical, it was devastating. The tax didn't just reduce profits. It reduced the very thing old money counted on, stability. Suddenly, the cost of living like a Vanderbilt soared while the money coming in shrank. Maintaining mansions, servants, carriages, yachts, and enormous staffs was no longer a demonstration of status. It was a financial burden. Then the estate tax followed, ensuring that each generation would inherit less and less. And finally, the most brutal blow of all, the Great Depression. The stock market crash of 1929 wiped out investments across the family tree. Incomes vanished. Dividends evaporated. The fourth generation of Vanderbilts found themselves asset-rich but cash-poor owners of homes they could not heat, estates they could not staff, and legacies they could no longer afford to preserve. The fallout was swift. The massive mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York were demolished. Marble House became unaffordable. The family chateau in North Carolina became a financial sinkhole. Dozens of Vanderbilt estates across the country were shuttered, abandoned, or sold. The New York mansion that Cornelius II built, once the largest private residence in Manhattan, was torn down in 1926, replaced by modern buildings that cared nothing for ancestry or grandeur. Block by block, the dynasty's architectural empire was erased. And through it all stood the Breakers, intact, magnificent, and impossibly expensive. The annual tax bill alone was more than most Americans earned in a lifetime. Heating the house required over 150 tons of coal each year. The roof, the plumbing, the gardens, the staff quarters, the electrical systems, everything cost a fortune even before hiring a single servant. Alice Vanderbilt, widowed and aging, kept it alive through sheer willpower. But even she knew the truth. The palace her husband had built was becoming financially suicidal. When she died in 1934, the house passed to their daughter, Gladys Vanderbilt Shacheny, along with an impossible question. What do you do with a $240 million mansion you can't afford to keep and can't afford to lose? To sell it meant demolition. No private buyer wanted a 70-room palace during an economic collapse. Some demolition companies even offered to buy it for scrap. They would tear the house apart piece by piece, sell the marble, auction the chandeliers, melt down the hardware, and leave an empty cliffside lot where America's greatest mansion once stood. Gladys refused. This was more than real estate. It was her father's masterpiece, the last great symbol of a dynasty that had once dominated America. But sentiment could not overcome arithmetic. the family debated solutions. Some suggested selling the surrounding land. Others proposed subdividing the mansion, turning grand rooms into apartments, or converting the property into a hotel. A few voices urged the unthinkable: tear it down before it bankrupts the family entirely. Arguments grew sharp. Siblings stopped speaking. Cousins accused each other of selfishness or disloyalty. The breakers had become a battlefield. But as the years passed, Gladys realized there was only one way out, a choice that seemed humiliating for a family that once symbolized American supremacy: give the mansion away, not to friends, not to buyers, but to the public. If a nonprofit could take over operations, open the house for tour, and use ticket revenue to fund maintenance, the breakers could survive. The Vanderbilt name would lose ownership, but the building would live. In 1948, Gladys made the decision that saved the palace. She leased the breakers to the Preservation Society of Newport County for $1 per year. The society opened the mansion to the public, charging small admission fees and using the revenue to support restoration. Tourists, ordinary men and women who once could never dream of entering such a palace, walked through the Great Hall, touched the marble, stared at platinum walls, and whispered in awe. The breakers was no longer a symbol of exclusivity. It had become a museum, democratic, crowded, accessible. And with that shift, the Vanderbilt dynasty closed its last chapter. What they could not afford to keep, the public would carry forward. The breakers survived not because of wealth, but because of surrender. A palace built to prove that the Vanderbilts would reign forever was saved only when the Vanderbilts admitted they could no longer reign at all. When you stand before the breakers today, with tourists strolling across the great lawn and the Atlantic wind carrying salt through the arches of the loggia, it's almost impossible to imagine how close this mansion came to disappearing. Not from fire this time, but from neglect, economics, and the quiet decay that swallowed almost every other Gilded Age palace. And yet the breakers remains, not as a Vanderbilt estate, not as a private home, but as a monument, a survivor of time. Its survival is no accident. It is the result of decades of determination, argument, sacrifice, and preservation, and it is in many ways the most unlikely chapter of its entire story. After Gladys Vanderbilt Shachny leased the mansion for a symbolic $1, the Preservation Society of Newport County stepped into a role no one had imagined for it: guardian of America's most extravagant architectural legacy. Here was a nonprofit made up of local residents, teachers, historians, volunteers, suddenly inheriting responsibility for an Italian Renaissance palace built by one of the richest men in American history. They had no blueprint, no manual, no institutional wealth to lean on. What they had instead was something far rarer: conviction. They believed the breakers belonged not just to the Vanderbilts, but to the country, to history, and to the generations who would one day try to understand how an age of such extravagance ever existed at all. The Preservation Society began with basic repairs: patching roofs, replacing worn stone, stabilizing the structure. But they soon realized the mansion required far more care than that. Gilded Age architecture was not built for easy upkeep. The walls of imported stone required specialists. The gilded ceilings needed artisans trained in 19th century techniques. Even the electrical systems, upgraded in the mid-20th century, had to be carefully laid so they didn't disturb original surfaces. What the Vanderbilts once maintained with dozens of servants, the society now had to preserve with fundraising, research, and a dedicated staff. Every year brought new challenges. Salt from the ocean quietly eroded arches. Storm winds damaged stone. Moisture seeped into the walls. Age weighed on every corner of the mansion. Restoration became a constant cycle, a living process, not a project with an end date. And yet the society persisted. And slowly, the house that had survived fire and financial collapse began to re-emerge in its full brilliance. By the 1970s and 1980s, the breakers transformed into one of the most visited historic homes in America. Today, more than 400,000 people walk through its doors each year, more than the population of some states. They come from around the world: students, architects, historians, casual visitors, families, curious travelers. Some arrive simply to see beauty, others to understand wealth, others still to confront the contradictions of a mansion built on both privilege and labor. Tour groups cross the Great Hall, pausing under a ceiling once meant to impress America's elite. They step into the music room, now awestruck by the platinum-covered walls. They marvel at the dining room, imagining the ceremonies that once unfolded beneath those chandeliers. They stand on the loggia, staring at the same horizon Cornelius once watched, a horizon he believed symbolized dominion. But the experience today is different. This palace, once fiercely guarded, is now democratic. A house built for 1% of 1% is now open to millions. The Preservation Society has continued expanding its efforts, maintaining not only the breakers but multiple Newport mansions threatened by the passage of time. They fundraise, research, partner with artisans, and use modern technology to protect structures that were never built for longevity. Yet even with all this progress, the breakers has not escaped controversy. In recent years, the Society proposed a modern welcome center, a structure intended to improve visitor services and accommodate the huge crowds that now come each year. Preservationists fought bitterly over the plan. Some argued the mansion's view and historic landscape would be disrupted. Others insisted the crowds were overwhelming the property and required better infrastructure. Letters were written, debates grew heated, Newport split into factions. It was a modern echo of the old tensions that had always surrounded the breakers, questions of access, identity, ownership, and legacy. In the end, a modest visitor center was approved, designed to blend into the landscape and support the preservation efforts financially. Even in the 21st century, the breakers remained a battleground of ideals, but perhaps that is fitting. Perhaps a building that was born out of rivalry, ambition, fire, and reinvention was never meant to sit quietly. The question remains, why did this mansion survive when nearly every other Gilded Age estate vanished? The answer lies not in marble or money, but in meaning. Most Gilded Age mansions were symbols of excess without story, grand but empty. The breakers, however, became more than a house. It became a narrative, a palace born from disaster, a monument to a family's rise, a reflection of a nation transitioning from old aristocracy to industrial power, a victim of financial collapse. A survivor rescued by the public, the breakers carries history in its bones, the triumphs and tragedies of the Vanderbilt dynasty, the labor of immigrants, the extravagance of an age that believed wealth could last forever, and the humbling truth that even the greatest fortunes can fall. It is a house that refused to die. Fire tried to take it, economics tried to crush it, modernity tried to ignore it, time tried to wear it down, still it stands. The same waves crash against the same cliffs. The same wind sweeps across the same loggia. The same ceilings glitter in the afternoon sun, just as they did when the first guests walked through the Great Hall more than a century ago. The breakers is no longer the seat of a dynasty. It is no longer a private court or a palace of exclusivity. It is something far more powerful, a guardian of memory. A reminder of how ambition builds, how fortune fades, how legacies fracture, and how history survives not because of wealth, but because someone decides the past is worth saving. In the end, the breakers is the story of America itself. Dazzling, flawed, ambitious, tragic, and unyieldingly resilient. The mansion born from fire, threatened by collapse, saved by the public, and carried forward by time stands today as both a warning and a wonder. The house that should have vanished stands still, because some stories refuse to burn.